Welcome to the second episode of Comics Secret History. My name is Mikey Crotty. I'd like to thank everyone who took the trouble to sit through the whole of the last episode, and especially those who went to the effort of spreading the word. Thank you so much for your assistance. This episode follows the pattern of the first, presenting the actual facts around famous or infamous events in recent-ish comics history in an effort to balance the overwhelmingly false narratives that perpetuate comics journalism and media. Today's episode is called Neil Gaiman, Comics, Court Cases, Cults, and Conspiracies. I'd like to thank John McDermott of The Economist, Daniel Best of the Oh Danny Boy blog, and Tony Ortega of The Underground Bunker for assisting in navigating this piece's minefields. This episode is respectfully dedicated to Johannes Hermanus Scheepers. Tens of thousands of folks have seen or heard Neil Gaiman talking about his life, and millions have read about his death, but no one has ever known his name. Until now. Citation fans, fact-checkers, Scientology lawyers, grab a pencil and pad or just pause the screen, as there will be some links to some interesting sites you can visit. 20 years ago in 2002, two comic book titans clashed in a Wisconsin courtroom over a case that was deliberately framed as good versus evil, involving an angel and a hellspawn and comic creators' rights. 10 years ago, in 2012, after bankruptcies and appeals, the case between acclaimed author Neil Gaiman and acclaimed comics artist Todd McFarlane was settled. And the history of it, emphasized by Gaiman and his team, reflects that the good guy, Neil Gaiman, won, and comics creators and comics charities were apparently the ultimate beneficiaries. But given the very specific public justification and promises made by the victor, how does what exactly happened subsequently, in the last decade, long after the court battles ended, reflect on the events of 10 and 20 years ago? The story actually begins 30 years ago in 1992, when McFarlane, along with 6 colleagues, quit their highly lucrative work-for-hire jobs at Marvel Comics and risked their careers and livelihoods to set up their own company, Image Comics, which would publish and foster work owned not by their employers, but 100% by the creators of the comics. Their risk paid off. And though they were now responsible for all costs involved in producing, promoting, and publishing their own books, they also reaped all the rewards, instead of the usual scenario in comics, where the publisher owned and controlled the creations, paying the creators a small fraction of the comic sales, and little to no portion of any media or merchandising income, particularly in the case of Marvel. Image Comics changed all that. When they launched in 1992, the comics market was on a sales bubble high, thanks in no small part to the previous corporate Marvel Comics work of the 7 artists who founded it. All Image launched titles sold approximately 1 million copies or more. And within months, the founders who were funding everything were looking to spread the wealth and success by inviting other creators to publish through them, or even join their creator-owned titles for much larger remunerations than was possible at the big two, Marvel and DC. Since then, thousands of creators have published their books through Image, where they can retain all the rights and profits, and in return, Image charges a fixed fee for publishing. Neil Gaiman joined the story when, as a bold publicity stunt, McFarlane hired 4 of the most respected writers in comics at the time to write 4 consecutive issues of his creator-owned Spawn comic for what was then the single biggest writer's payday for a monthly comic in history. $100,000, regardless of sales. McFarlane's deal, while subsequently shown to be naive, embodied the anti-corporate, pro-creator ideals of Image. There would be no instructions as to what to write, no mandates on the story content, no editorial control, and all 4 writers would be paid exactly the same, regardless of subsequent sales. And they wouldn't have to sign any legal contracts. And this was McFarlane's first mistake. Even though all of the writers agreed, one of them, Neil Gaiman, would later take issue with this. The other 3 writers, Alan Moore, Dave Sim, and Frank Miller, never sued or publicly disagreed with McFarlane over this. And it was this that would end up costing McFarlane and gaining Gaiman a fortune. For all the subsequent updates, interesting details, and very evocative framing, this was mostly on Gaiman's side. McFarlane really never gave interviews or press releases about the case. It was this single detail and point of law, the lack of a written contract, that would actually end up ensuring Gaiman victory. The simple point of law was that in the absence of a written contract, the deal couldn't have been a simple work-for-hire deal, as McFarlane argued and Gaiman strenuously denied, though without the support or endorsement of his fellow 3 guest writers. This win led to later cases for remuneration, which Gaiman also won. The initial 2002 court case and its subsequent cases generated the most public interest in comics history, thanks to Gaiman's innovative plan to fund and promote his case. Despite being a millionaire best-selling author at the time, Gaiman decided to get Marvel Comics, which he had never worked for and had and still has to this day an appalling record in creators' rights, to fund his lawsuit against McFarlane. He also announced that he was suing the publisher Image Comics as well, who he never had any direct dealings with and didn't profit from his work. Even more radically, Gaiman, with Marvel's assistance, was going to use crowdfunding of comic fans and comic shops to pay for all his legal expenses by writing a mini-series for Marvel where himself and Marvel would donate all of the sales profits into a new company, Marvels and Miracles, to cover all of his costs in suing McFarlane and the rest of Marvel's former employees at Image. This was announced well in advance of the comic series 1602 debut, so fans could support creators' rights and comic charities merely by purchasing a copy. As skewed as this scheme may seem in hindsight, a massively successful millionaire teaming up with a corporate pariah of creators' rights, suing the biggest comics company founded on creators' rights over creators' rights, it was presented and sold as brilliantly as one would expect from a master wordsmith like Gaiman. On the 24th of October 2001, Gaiman and Marvel held a joint press conference where his lawsuit was revealed and carefully framed. At this conference, Marvel Comics then editor-in-chief Joe Quesada and the company's president Bill Jemas, accompanied by Gaiman, announced the formation of Marvel and Miracles LLC, founded by Neil Gaiman and his lawyer Kenneth F. Levin, whose purpose was to collect funds to allow Gaiman to fight his court battles with Todd McFarlane, with any funds left over to go to different charities. In his crowdfunding sales pitch, Gaiman claimed his action was about honoring promises, doing the right thing, and creators' rights, specifically reclaiming some rights to a character he didn't create or own called Miracle Man, which he stated McFarlane had promised him verbally in 1997, in an effort to resolve his long-running concern over the lack of a written contract for his work on McFarlane's Spawn comics. The issues concerning Miracle Man and what, if any, rights to it McFarlane had are very complex and convoluted, but fortunately they are irrelevant because as soon as Gaiman was in a position to remove them from the case to focus solely on his own financial remuneration, he did so at the conclusion of the 2002 case. In case any potential 1602 funders might worry that the lawsuit paid for by other people's money was purely for personal gain and damaging the comic publisher established by ex-Marvel employees, Gaiman and his lawyers repeatedly stated this was definitely not the case, before, during, and after all the cases. Beginning with the very first press conference in 2001, where Gaiman said, "I plan to dedicate all of the profits which any Miracle Man publishing might generate, beyond those needed to make sure that all the original creators are being properly paid, and also to comics-related charitable organizations." After winning his first case against McFarlane and surprisingly choosing personal financial remuneration over whatever Miracle Man rights McFarlane had promised him, he and his legal team made clear again and again that Gaiman wouldn't personally benefit from all the monies won in a case funded by his fans and Marvel. In January 2002, the Pulse on Comic-Con quoted Gaiman, "This suit is not about the money. It's about respecting the rights of the creator and keeping promises." His lawyer, Ken Levin, added, "Neil has been on record since before the case was filed that any monies remaining from those he receives from the suit after his attorney's fees are paid will all be donated to comics-related charities, including in particular the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund." Levin added later, "And as you may also know, if Neil nets any money from this, it's all already promised to charity. When it comes to acting based on principle, just because it's just the right thing to do, Neil is one of our heroes, and deservedly so." Gaiman reassured folks of their benevolent intentions long after their publicity-driven sales appeal to fund his case and the case's resolution. In June 2010, he posted on his journal, "As I said in interviews at the time, any money received from the case after paying lawyers' bills goes to comics charities. Either way, it'll be good to get it wrapped up, and to get payment from McFarlane on many things it's already been established that he owes, and to be able to write a couple of large checks to some comics charities." 2 years later, in 2012, after the resolution of the case, and just 3 months before he ended up establishing his foundation to distribute the solicited funds, Gaiman again reiterated on his Tumblr account, and it was reported by comicsbeat.com. Remember, this is 3 months before he started distributing the funds. "And I stated when I filed the court case against Todd that I was giving any and all money I made from the legal case to comics-related charities. Stated it again, every time we won another round, and it's still true. I said I was doing it for the principle of the thing, And I was. As the facts will show, it wasn't. Despite how many times he stated it, it wasn't true at all. The exact details of the settlement are shrouded in legal secrecy. Certain details are a matter of public record. What is a fact is that $382,000 that was lodged in escrow by McFarlane in 2008 was released to Gaiman in 2012. We also know, thanks to filings by McFarlane in relation to closing a Chapter 11 bankruptcy order, that he also paid $1.1 million, recorded as Gaiman settlement, prior to March 2012. Aside from this, Gaiman also received all the profits, both his and Marvel's, from the sales of the 8-part 1602 miniseries. Each issue retailed at $3.50, and there's an approximate standard accounting that the publisher nets slightly over a third of that. 1602 was the best-selling dollar value comic of the year 2003, according to Gaiman, and the first issue sales, which do decline from there, sold approximately 200,000 copies. So an estimate of Marvel and Gaiman's profits at roughly $800,000 for the entire 8-issue best-selling run is on the conservative side, which Gaiman would have had since 2003-2004. So far, based on the available facts and again, erring on conservatively educated estimates, Gaiman had amassed well over $2 million to fund Marvels and Miracles to fight McFarlane, pay his legal fees and costs, with the remainder all going to comics charities, as promised to the folks who funded him. But there was even more, as Gaiman benevolently wasn't finished fundraising even after he won his 2002 case. In summer 2003, over a year after winning his first case and deliberately removing the character Miracle Man copyrights or ownership from any remuneration he was due, Gaiman decided to license the Miracle Man character he neither created nor owned as a statuette to raise funds for Marvels and Miracles LLC. 1,500 of these were sold at a retail price of $140 each, raising approximately $240,000. According to Miracle Man aficionado and author of Poison Chalice, Podrigo Maloid, the statuette's box even stated Miracle Man TM&C Marvels and Miracles LLC, though this was clearly untrue. The base of each statuette, licensed to sculptor Randy Bound by Gaiman and his lawyer, Ken Levin, stated Miracle Man, TM&C, Marvels and Miracles LLC, and also produced under license from Marvel Characters Inc. Neither Gaiman, Levin, nor Marvel had any ownership of Miracle Man or rights to license him at this time, or to sell them for almost $250,000. Miracle Man creator Mick Anglo and the late great Gary Leach, whose artwork and redesign the piece was based on, were not even referenced. While it may appear that Gaiman and his lawyer were indulging in exactly the same kind of behavior that they were suing McFarlane for, it should be noted that they clearly weren't. McFarlane paid Gaiman over $212,000 before apparently becoming distrustful of him, while Gaiman and Marvels and Miracles LLC never paid the then octogenarian creator of Miracle Man, Mick Anglo, who was living on a state pension and caring for his invalid wife, or Gary Leach, whose work and redesign it was based on, a single cent. How much exactly Gaiman and Levin's Marvels and Miracles LLC netted from the Miracle Man statuette sales has never been revealed. Gaiman's articulate testimony in the 2002 case he brought against McFarlane is fascinating. He painted a picture of 1992 where he, unlike all his fellow guest writers, was seriously concerned by the lack of a legal contract, establishing what he would be entitled to in the future from his work on the single comic. Though much of the case and its evidence is legally shrouded, Gaiman's testimony is not, and there are some remarkable admissions and statements, particularly when viewed with the hindsight of what Gaiman did with his winnings, or rather didn't do, to date. Gaiman's testimony reveals that despite his concerns over the lack of a contract for the single guest-written issue of Spawn in 1992, he subsequently lobbied McFarlane to write an Angela miniseries and contribute to another issue of Spawn years later, when there was still no contract in place. Although Gaiman and his lawyers argued in court that his work was never work for hire, nor did Gaiman ever consider it as such, every single contract Gaiman referred to or presented in the court for McFarlane to match identifiable as a work-for-hire contract. It's also in these testimonies that Gaiman admits to being a member of and working for the Church of Scientology for the very first time on public record. Gaiman's history with Scientology is murky, very deliberately so. It's not something Gaiman ever speaks about, and his testimony from the 2002 case clearly illustrates how even the simplest, most direct query about it to him can be non-clarified by him. Asked in the 2002 testimony, "Are you still involved with the Church of Scientology?" Gaiman replies, "I don't understand the question." Subsequently asked, "Are you still a member of the Church of Scientology?" Gaiman replies, "I don't consider myself as such." Even his admission that he worked for the church for 3 years is somewhat confusing. Gaiman said, "I worked for a 3-year period after getting out of school as a counselor for the Church of Scientology." In fact, Gaiman actually worked as an auditor in a process made famous in the award-winning 2015 documentary Going Clear, which explains how officials in the Church of Scientology keep in-depth records on everything its members say during private auditing sessions. And then they use their secrets against them. Respected journalist and author on Scientology Tony Ortega wrote of auditing. Many former Scientologists have testified that the files are actually mined for blackmail material, and we've seen with our own eyes how Scientology uses that confidential information to smear former members on anonymous websites. It's truly one of Scientology's most vile practices. According to Ortega, Gaiman became a Class 8 auditor and even ran the Birmingham org as its ED, or executive director. The Scientology connection to Gaiman's case revealed in his own testimony may be irrelevant, particularly with Gaiman's own deliberate obfuscation over his role and actual history of the church. It could be that his training and experience as a Scientology auditor to identify weaknesses that can be exploited for financial gain played no part in his personal efforts to solicit additional work focused on a character he co-created for years, despite his concerns over the lack of a written contract, work that he lobbied for which would prove so legally crucial in his subsequent cases. In fairness to Gaiman, it could be very common for people deeply concerned over the lack of a contract to lobby for additional work under the same circumstances. But whether deliberate or coincidental, Gaiman's attempts to obscure rather than clarify any links between himself and Scientology only enhance the links between this case, the funds raised supposedly for comics charities, and internet conspiracy theories. Gaiman's family are essentially British Scientology royalty. His parents were devout and prominent members from the early days of the church. In the early 60s, they moved to Harwood House, miles from anywhere on the outskirts of a town called East Grinstead in Essex, a house that happened to be only a mile from Scientology's UK headquarters, and where founder L. Ron Hubbard called home, known as Saint Hill Manor. There the Gaimans worked for the church and lodged Scientology students from around the world. His father, David Gaiman, was the church's chief spokesperson and deputy leader of their Guardian office in the UK from the 1960s through the 70s, and as such a fairly famous person in the UK at the time. Now, I'm about to speak about events pertaining to Neil's father from the late 60s when Neil was just a small child. Regardless of age, I don't believe it is ever right to ever visit any sins of the father on their children, which is why I have deliberately excised many of the more infamous, well-publicized at the time things that David Gaiman did for Scientology. However, as you'll see in this history, in 2013, the adult Neil took possession of one of his father's sins, 50 years after his father declared it under oath, and over a decade after he himself declared under oath in the McFarlane trial that he didn't consider himself a Scientologist. Neil took this sin and he spruced it all up before presenting it to the world as his own, which is why the events of August 31st, 1968 are as pertinent to Neil as his father David. In July 1968, the UK declared L. Ron Hubbard persona non grata in the UK, and foreign Scientologists were banned from entering the UK. Just a month later, one of the Gaiman's lodgers at Harwood House, Johannes Hermanus Scheepers, a South African opal miner, committed suicide on August 31st using the family's Mini. Johannes had travelled thousands of miles from South Africa in the hope that this new religion, Scientology, would free him from his mental anguish. Scientology promised as much in its promotional materials at the time. David Gaiman even publicly promoted its promise of being able to achieve what psychiatry, mental health institutions, medication, and even GPs could not. Just a week before his lodger's suicide, David Gaiman wrote to The Observer in response to an article critical of Scientology. I am a little bored with the allegation that everyone in Scientology is either neurotic, weak-witted, or naive, especially since the mentally and physically ill are not permitted Scientology training and processing. Scientology is for the able and effective, and from this stratum of society we draw our membership. The timing of the suicide of his lodger came at a very unfortunate time for David Gaiman. He was the primary figure in a libel suit taken by Scientology against his local MP, Mr. Jeffrey Johnson Smith. Gaiman initiated the suit as he was offended by comments John Smith made only a month previously, in July 1968, that Scientologists direct themselves deliberately towards the weak, the unbalanced, the immature, the rootless, and the mentally or emotionally unstable. According to a contemporary report in The Times in September 1968, it was revealed at his inquest that Scheepers described himself as a Scientology student on his alien registration card entering the country, just as the ban came into effect, and that he left 2 notes saying his suicide shouldn't be blamed on Scientology, despite him being a Scientologist. Neil's father, David, who was described in the report as a senior executive of the cult, denied on oath that his dead lodger had been a student at the headquarters a mile away, or had any connection to Scientology. In testimony involving hearsay from his wife, David Gaiman painted an unflattering portrait of the deceased as a failed gambling addict, who had lost all his money, which fortunately provided a nice, neat explanation for his suicide. His testimony was also very fortunate in regards to his recent public defense of Scientology, the legality of the Gaimans lodging foreign Scientologists after they had been banned from the country, and his forthcoming libel case, as it excused the Gaimans and Scientology from any involvement with the deceased or his suicide. David Gaiman even stated that he went to the trouble of a thorough check of Scientology documents, which showed the gambling loser, who he didn't really know, had not been registered at any Scientology establishments in Britain. This photo is of David Gaiman with his colleague Jane Kember, who headed up the Guardian's office together. If you have the time, Google her. The Times' contemporary coverage of the inquest and David Gaiman's sworn testimony can be found and read along with a link to the actual cutting at www.zenu-directory.net/news/library-item.php?iid equals 5059. Now, some cynics might think that David Gaiman concocted the desecration of Johannes Scheepers at the inquest into his suicide to protect the church, avoid damaging his forthcoming libel trial, and distract any questions about the care and attention Johannes received while under the roof of the Gaimans and under the control of the church. Some might think that, but not Neil Gaiman. Just like his father before him, Neil also wiped all traces of Scientology from the suicide of Johannes Scheepers in 2013, when he used his tragic death as the inspiration for his best-selling award-winning novel, The Ocean at the End of the Lane, now also a critically acclaimed play. As per his father David's sworn testimony, Neil's story involves a South African miner who steals his father's car and commits suicide after gambling away all of his and his friend's money. The friend's money seems to be an addition by Neil, not evident in any reports of his father's testimony, which serves to reflect even worse on Johannes' character, presumably based on some truth only Neil is aware of. This is also the account he uses in all interviews and talks about the work, carefully excising any and all involvement or reference to Scientology. Neil has spoken about the true story of Johannes Scheepers' suicide in dozens and dozens of interviews across the world. In the book itself, there's an interview with Neil about the real Johannes at the back. So he told me the story of a South African lodger, who I do not actually remember meeting, who had smuggled all of his friends' money out of South Africa, and which he was going to bank for them. because there were apparently limits to what you could take out of South Africa. He went to Brighton, to a casino, and spent all his money, and his friends' money. Then he came back, stole the car, drove it to the end of the lane, and committed suicide in it. Neil Gaiman's Scientology-free desecration of Johannes Schieper's last few weeks and tidy explanation for his suicide also feature in almost a dozen public speaking engagements that can be viewed on YouTube. Just search for Gaiman, Talk, and Ocean. Here's an example from a public talk hosted by Lenny Henry.
Answer or a story. I said to my dad, I used to love that white Mini that you had. And I remember one day we came home from school and the Mini had gone, and instead you had this ancient Jaguar with old red leather seats that smelled like other people's cigars that you just picked up, you traded the car in for. I never understood why you'd got rid of the Mini. And he said, I never told you that. And I said, no, you never did. He said, well, back in 1967, he said, we had a lodger who came from South Africa, and he brought you couldn't take money out of South Africa back then, but his friends had all given him a lot of money to bring to the UK and bank for them. So he had. And one night he'd gone down to Brighton and he started gambling at the casino in Brighton. And he kept gambling at the casino in Brighton, and then he thought he'd just sort of dip into their money to fix things.
The way you do.
The way you do. And
seven! Come on, seven! He was that guy.
He was that guy. And then there wasn't any money, and he came back to the house. He took the keys to the Mini from the table, took a garden hose, drove down to the end of the lane, and Dad said at 5 o'clock in the morning there was a knock on the door. He'd been spotted by a milk van, a lorry picking up the milk, and I had to go down in my dressing gown and identify the body.
Oh my God, that's in the book.
So being an author...
You put that in the book?
Yeah.
As stated earlier, the addition of Johannes gambling all his friends' money away, as well as engaging in some illicit activity in smuggling the money into the country, appear to be some of just the wonderful whimsy Gaiman is famous for. While it appears Neil may have researched the importation of cash from South Africa into the UK, rather than the actual circumstances of Johannes' suicide, my own research could find no evidence that such measures existed at the time. So it's really just unfortunate that Neil's additional details, which may very well be true based on his own research, reflect even poorer on Johannes Schieper's. The Ocean at the End of the Lane is currently in development as a major motion picture by Focus Features and Playtone. There is, of course, no way that Neil Gaiman could have been aware of the truth when it happened in 1968, but he's had 50 years to figure it out. The fact his family were and are Scientology zealots, or that they lodged only Scientology students, like his first wife Mary, escaped his memory when his father recounted the tale to him in 2006 or 2007. And then he forgot all about it again in 2012 when writing the book. And he forgot or was completely unaware of his father's concurrent libel cases and testimony at the inquest. Maybe he forgot to look into it or do any research when regaling the public with the true story behind the book in all those interviews and talks. Which is a shame, as it took me a few hours to figure out the facts and I'm not a professional writer. It's actually lucky that, as per the Gaiman's generational account, that Johannes Schieper's had nothing to do with Scientology, despite what he himself stated when entering the UK and when departing this mortal coil. Depression, anxiety, mental illness, and suicidal thoughts were not really tolerated by the church at this time, as was evident in David Gaiman's libel action, and in letters he wrote when he spearheaded a failed Scientology campaign to take control of the UK's foremost mental health charity, the National Association for Mental Health, now known as MIND. On February 5th, 1969, while masterminding a membership drive that would see him installed as the chairman of the charity, he wrote a letter to NAMH's public relations officer. It opened, Dear opposite number, how does it feel to be hit? The public sentiment against psychiatry has been bad for years. Lately it has worsened. I have a good idea it will get much, much worse. Raping women patients, murdering inmates, castrating men, committing without real process of law. The psychiatrist has been a very bad boy. David Gaiman's coup failed, and he was subsequently cited in a US government case against Scientology involving the theft, censoring, and falsifying of documents in the US judicial system. He went on to become the head of the church's public relations in the UK, as well as a very successful property entrepreneur, securing premises for the church. Gaiman's parents also founded a still thriving multi-million-pound vitamin business, G&G Vitamins, where one of its products, niacin, is a vital part of Scientology's purification process. On the one hand, it's understandable that Gaiman would want to distance himself from Scientology, given the religion's archaic and some might say offensive views on the likes of mental health, homosexuality, and transgender issues that run contrary to his own espoused public views. Famous former high-ranking Scientologists like actress Leah Remini and former international spokesman Mike Rinder have spoken out about Scientology's dangerous beliefs. The church doctrine thinks that fields of psychology and psychiatry are a sham, Remini said. They deny mental illness and afflictions. They promote that you can heal your psychosomatic issues with their technology. They will get in the way of people taking medications. They will prevent people from getting the real medical help that they need, and in some cases have caused suicides because of it. Scientology is mentally abusive because we are all taught that we are responsible for everything. And Rinder says of Scientology's stance on homosexuality, the church has a chart of human evaluation from Hubbard that helps Scientologists discern who they should have in their life. A 1.1 is the lowest on the scale and includes people who need a lot of help but aren't worth helping. That rank includes gay people. So it is obvious why Gaiman would want to distance himself from the church. But it's his own actions which make this separation unclear, clouded by his own statements and then unsupported if not contradicted by the facts. This is the primary reason why unsubstantiated internet conspiracy theories have grown around Gaiman's connection to Scientology, and in particular unsupported claims that he still somehow secretly funds the church, whose history and beliefs are so abhorrent to his own stated beliefs, shared by his devoted audience. In 2012, when he started writing Ocean at the End of the Lane, Gaiman said, "And I stated when I filed the court case against Todd that I was giving any and all money I made from the legal case to comics-related charities. Stated it again, every time we won another round. And it's still true. I said I was doing it for the principle of the thing, and I was." And he established the Gaiman Foundation LLC 3 months later. Here's the website's address. Give it a visit and see all comics charities they donated to. www.gaimanfoundation.org. Thanks to the company being an LLC, all its yearly tax filings are available online and easily accessible to the public, who he asked to help fund his case. Just type the Gaiman Foundation LLC into Google. Particularly useful is the website open990.org. You can access the annual financial records via clicking on the links at the bottom of the Open 990 page. These clearly show that Gaiman didn't do what he promised he would and stated was true repeatedly. The fund, it turns out, was seeded in 2012 with McFarlane's escrow money of $382,000, and of the remaining estimated $2 million plus, Gaiman netted additional funds on top of this in 2013 when he sold the Spawn character he co-created, Angela, with McFarlane to Marvel after he was awarded full ownership of it. Approximately another $300,000 shows up in the accounts up until 2019. While it's entirely possible that Gaiman's legal costs accounted for this drastic reduction between what he amassed and the fraction thereof that was eventually deposited into the foundation, it's impossible to confirm as Gaiman never offered his funders and supporters any accounting. Still, by any accounts, close to $700,000 in total is a phenomenal amount of charity, especially for comics charities. Though sadly, by the Gaiman Foundation's actual accounts, only $120,000 of that went to any comics charities. In fact, only one comic charity has benefited from the Gaiman Foundation in its decade of existence. The decade is somewhat deceptive, as the foundation stopped charitable donations and went dormant, according to all US company checks, in 2019, just before the pandemic, with $300,000 still sitting in its coffers. Of the approximate $400,000 that has been charitably distributed to date, most of it appears to have gone to favored charity projects of the foundation board, consisting of Gaiman's wife and his adult children. The $120,000 that did go to a comics charity all went to the Comics Book Defense Legal Fund, which Gaiman happened to be a director of at the time. The next largest chunk of the crowd-funded charitable donations, $50,000, went to one of his children to cover administration, in the principled time-honored tradition of family foundations using money promised to charity to pay themselves. In total, the amount paid out since the foundation was set up in 2012 till it ceased operations a few years ago is less than $400,000. Coincidentally, the same as the amount McFarlane deposited into escrow. It's a shame to see the approximate $300,000 left after all the lawyers' fees and Neil's expenses sit idling while the pandemic provided so many charitable opportunities. As I write this, the death of Marvel Man, Miracle Man artist and co-creator Gary Leach comes to mind, prompted, I suppose, by Gaiman using his redesigned artwork to raise so much money for his foundation and all the comics charities it would help, without acknowledging Gary in any way. Apropos of nothing, the Wonderful Heroes initiative, supported by Gary Leach, is fundraising in his memory at the moment, while the Gaiman Foundation has approximately $300,000 raised by his crowd-funded victory of Todd McFarlane, just sitting around doing nothing. Just saying. Maybe some of you could say it too if you agree. And that is actually how the greatest court battle in comics history between two of its most popular creators, with creators' rights and comics charities as the supposed victors, ends. Only a fraction of the money solicited for comics charities made it into the foundation's coffers with no accounting for all those who contributed, and only a fraction of that donated to a single comics-related charity, the one Neil was the director of. Sadly, for an author of Gaiman's stature and principled reputation, the true facts of what happened to all the solicited funds promised to comics charities, much like his relationship with Scientology, will remain obscured, which is exactly as he wants it. He has been critically acclaimed and made millions of dollars by peddling updated hearsay from his father concerning the tragic Scientology-related suicide of Johannes Scheepers. He lied to his community of supporters concerning their contributions to his charitable donations. But despite all that, comics history still records that in the most famous court case ever for creators' rights, the good guy won. Thank you so much for listening. I'm working on the third episode at the moment. I think it'll take a little bit longer than a week. Your best bet, if you've enjoyed these two episodes, is to subscribe. That way you get to find out first when the next episode goes up. Stay safe, everybody.